Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Embrace webinar series. Today, we are on Embrace webinar number 21, believe it or not. And we'll be having a second webinar conversation with Preston Sprinkle. He is a friend of the ECC, and he has advised us with regard to Embrace ever since the beginning. In fact, he was our very first webinar. So we're delighted to have him with us again today. Preston Sprinkle also recently published a book called Embodied, Transgender Identities, the Church, and What the Bible Has to Say. And so we're going to be exploring those themes today. As a reminder, Embrace is a suite of human sexuality discipleship resources and experiences which are curated and created by Make and Deepen disciples of the Evangelical Covenant Church. And you can find us at covchurch.org/embrace. Embrace resources are in harmony with the adopted positions of the Evangelical Covenant Church, the center of which is that the Christian standard is faithfulness in heterosexual marriage and celibacy in singleness. The special emphasis of Embrace in all things and at all times is to equip our church to flourish in love for LGBT individuals and communities. My name is Michelle Sanchez, and I serve as Executive Minister of Make and Deepen Disciples for the Evangelical Covenant Church. Before we dive in, let me just name this, which is that most of our webinars so far and most of our experiences have had to do with sexual orientation rather than gender identity, which is what we're going to be exploring today. And those really are two very different areas with many different kinds of questions and pastoral implications. Please consider this conversation that we're having with Preston today one of the very beginning of conversations. We're continuing to learn and grow and understand. But again, what's most important for us is to continue to learn, to remain sensitive to people who have been traditionally misunderstood and marginalized, and to emphasize being Christ as much as we possibly can. Now, again, to help us with this conversation, we have Preston Sprinkle. Preston serves as the founder and president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. He is a biblical scholar, international speaker, and New York Times bestselling author who has written numerous books, including People to Be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And that was the subject of our very first Embrace webinar. Preston has given talks to thousands of people worldwide on the topic of faith, sexuality, and gender. And he and his wife, Chris, and their 4 children live in Idaho. So just a few housekeeping notes. We're going to begin with an interview. If we have any technical difficulties, just stick with us. We'll definitely be back online as soon as we can. And as always, we're going to leave as much time as possible at the end for questions. At any time throughout the webinar, feel free to type in your question into the Q&A box in the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can today. So again, welcome, and welcome to you, Preston.
Thanks for having me on again. Appreciate it.
Yes, always so fun to engage with you. So man, Preston, I read your book. Wow. Wow. I think that you wrote in the book that this was one of the hardest books or one of the hardest projects for you, just due to the complexity of the subject.
By far. I mean, there's several factors there. One is just the topic that of transgender identities, trans experiences involves many different academic disciplines to understand, but then also a wide diversity of lived experiences that are also equally important to understand, and combining those two together it took many years.
Okay, and listen, I always do my best to boil down the questions that I ask you to the most essential ones, and I really struggled to do that for this webinar. I mean, I had 30 essential questions. Again, which I think just speaks to the need for more education and for more kind of understanding with regard to this subject. So we'll get through, like I said, we'll get through as many of those as we can. But for all who are listening, I will just say, consider this really an introduction. And hopefully we will be engaging more into the future. All right. So, with all that being said, Preston, for those who have not yet read Embodied, can you give us a quick summary and can you clarify what you mean by transgender identities?
Sure, yeah. And a quick caveat, I literally just had a crown put in. I didn't
Oh
plan it
boy.
this way, so, uh, yeah, I feel like my face is large, so if I'm mumbling a little bit, it's not because I'm drinking this morning, it's because I am a bit numb.
Honestly, I couldn't tell. You're good, Preston.
Yeah, and on a more serious note, I do wanna just acknowledge, this should go without saying, but I think it's important to always acknowledge that I don't identify as trans, I don't experience gender dysphoria, and so everything that I'm gonna say here for the next hour, is incomplete. I hope it's good, I hope it's helpful, I hope it honors Jesus and is accurate, but this is always gonna my contribution is gonna be insufficient. Everybody needs to, walk with people in their lived experiences with trans identities and some that might experience gender dysphoria as well, which we'll get into these terms in a bit. The basic gist, I mean, it is hard to boil it down to a basic gist. The phrase that I often use is I want to help people to think more deeply and love more widely through a conversation, a topic that oftentimes lacks both. One thing I lay out in the first chapter is that understanding the broader trans conversation, it does involve a lot of intellectual work. I mean, there's questions
Yes.
about human nature, biology, body brain relationship, then what does the Bible say about this, and what do we understand about gender dysphoria, and on and on and on it goes. These are complex anthropological, scientific, psychological, theological, ethical, and on it goes questions that are all part of the conversation, but that's half of the conversation. The other half is how do we love people well that have a minority experience, that may wrestle with gender dysphoria, which can be incredibly crippling and debilitating. And there's the question of even high rates of suicidality among people who identify as trans, and on that side goes. So concepts and people, we need to engage both well. To answer your second
Really good.
question, transgender identities, um, the trans experiences are incredibly diverse, and so the plural there is very, very intentional. I don't like the term transgenderism, and I know that's another question we might wrestle with. So yeah, transgender identities is deliberately trying to invest some plurality or diversity into the very conversation. So it's yeah, I mean, I have a whole chapter on this, the diversity of trans experiences and identities. And as Mark Yarhouse, a friend of ours who likes to say, if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. And so yeah, transgender identities can include many different kinds of identities and experiences and backgrounds and stories and perspectives and so on, which I'm sure we'll get to some of
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Awesome. And in your book, what you'll notice, friends, if you read the actual print book, is you have an asterisk
Mhm.
next to trans,
Yeah.
because you're including a variety of things in there. So just tell us what trans with the asterisk
Sure.
next to it. What does that
So,
mean?
so trans with the asterisk, and some people use it, some people don't, some people like it, some people don't like it. But yeah, I think the majority of trans people I talk to prefer this as an umbrella term that includes many other, if I can say, minority experiences within the trans conversation. So non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, pangender, demi gender, and then there's, I mean, literally
Yep.
dozens of other terms that are connected to the word gender. So trans with the asterisk is kind of an umbrella term that captures all of those experiences. So technically, transgender is one of many different kinds of identities under this broader trans umbrella. But sometimes people do use transgender as also an umbrella term. So again, people use terms differently, so it's hard to use one term that's going to satisfy everybody.
I think it is helpful for people to know that in your book you are not just referring to transgender, but to the larger umbrella term,
Yeah.
and the theological work that you're doing is applied to all of that.
Mhm.
Okay, why is this conversation important?
Well, it's important because it involves people, and especially a group of people that, for the most part, have had a relatively bad experience with the church or Christians. I mean, within the larger LGBTQ conversation, people who do identify along those identities, including the T, including trans people, many of them were raised in the Christian church. Overwhelming majority have had really, really bad experiences where they have been shamed and mocked and misunderstood and made fun of and sidelined or simply ignored. And so if anybody, if any kind of general group of people has had that kind of experience in the church, then when you read the gospels, you see that Jesus gravitated to people that were marginalized by the religious elite of the day. So for me, I think it just follows the rhythm of Jesus, who left the 99 to pursue the one, who had a heart for the outcast and marginalized, to be concerned about this conversation. That's first part. So I mean,
Yeah.
it involves people. There's also been a massive increase among teenagers identifying as trans, that umbrella term. In the United Kingdom, there's been a 5,000% increase just in teenage females going to gender clinics and seeking help. So there's been and we can maybe talk about why that is, but there's been a massive rise in among younger people identifying as trans. And then just societally, I mean, there's loads of stuff happening in politics and policies and big huge questions, athletics, that doesn't just involve the 1 2 3% of people that identify as trans. It involves everybody, because we're a society that has been structured along male and female lines, and the trans conversation forces us to ask questions about some of the basic structures of what it means to be human. So yeah, even though we are talking about a small percentage of people, technically it's actually a conversation that I think affects everybody. So it's
Good.
in 2021, it's not an option. Silence is not an option. We need to engage this conversation.
Thank you, Preston. Okay, another thing that I have really appreciated about you and your work over time is your sensitivity to language.
Mm-hmm.
So you're very careful about the language you use in terms of its impact on hearers. And again, our hope is always to be as hospitable as we can as believers. So let's talk about language for a little bit, terms, okay, before we go on, and they're particularly important for this conversation. So the difference between sex and gender.
Yeah.
Okay. People are no longer using those words in the same way. What do you mean by sex and what do you mean by gender?
This is great. And if there's one part of this conversation that people listening really need to pay attention, this is it. Because even when the questions come up, I'm gonna push on this. If people say sex or gender, I'm gonna hold you to your definition. Okay. And yeah, so up until, just as briefly as I can, up until the 1970s, sex and gender were basically synonyms. If you were a male or female, that was your sex, that was your gender. These terms were used interchangeably. After the 1970s, and I'll save you the backstory and why this happened, sex and gender began to be used to describe two different aspects of the human experience. Sex is reserved for biological sex, whether a Homo sapien is a male or a female, or there might be a small percentage that are both, which we refer to as intersex. Gender, though, has been used to describe what psychologists call a standard definition of gender would be the psychological and social aspects of being male or female. Gender, and so that's gender as a broad umbrella. That can be broken down into three different areas: gender identity, gender role, gender expression. Gender identity is almost always described as one's internal sense of who they are, whether their internal sense is male, female, both, or neither. Gender role has to do with the societal expectations of how males and females should act, and oftentimes the terms masculinity or femininity as cultural constructs are describing gender roles. And then you have gender expression, how you express your internal sense of who you are. Now, having said all that, so, and a couple things. Some people say, no, we shouldn't separate these two terms. And I'm like, okay, that's maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. The fact is, most people do. And the fact is, whether you like the term sex and gender used in this way, the definitions are, I think, helpful.
Yes.
Whether you think gender should be defined as, an internal sense of self, there is a thing called an internal sense of self that we all have. Okay, so it is there regardless of whether you like the terms matched up to this experience or not. And also, this is just the way people are using these terms. So protest all you want, but it's helpful to understand what they mean. So yeah, gender identity is the big one, one's internal sense of who they are. And as I say in the book, the most fundamental basic question on the conceptual level that we're all should be wrestling with is, if somebody experiences some kind of incongruence between their biological sex and their gender, let's just say their gender identity, then which one are they?
Right.
Does your biological sex determine who you are, or does your internal sense of who you are overrule biological sex if there's incongruence? That might sound, for some of you, are like, oh, I don't know, it sounds too heady, but that, however you answer that question, it has massive discipleship and pastoral implications. So this is not just how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, some abstract theological question with no practical ramifications. This question is fundamental for how we live deeper into the human nature that God has created us to be.
Okay. All right. So we're gonna hold that fundamental question and come right back to it.
Okay.
Now, as a rule of thumb, you do not use the word transgenderism.
Yeah.
And you also, I'll combine it with my next question. You also don't use the word cisgender.
Yeah.
So just talk to us about both of those terms.
Yeah, transgenderism. Most isms, I think, can be unhelpful. Not all of them, but what does that even mean? Transgenderism, like it's so broad and ambiguous, and it's almost always used in a negative way.
Yeah.
Most people that talk about transgenderism are kind of talking about some societal movement, and it's just kind of collapsing a whole diverse array of perspectives under one ism term. And I've heard several transgender people tell me, like, it just sounds like a disease. Like, oh, I came down with a bad case of transgenderism, but I took some penicillin and it went away. Like it just has a scent to it that's just very negative. Now there are times when I think it could fit, but in almost every case, there's other terms you can use that are a little more humanizing than transgenderism. I often talk about the transgender conversation might be better. Trans people is always a good one. And there's other transgender identities,
Trans experiences.
trans experiences. There's other So I try to avoid terms that are unnecessarily offensive. Yeah. And cisgender, that one, I will use it from time to time.
What does it mean, first of all?
What's that?
What does it mean?
Okay, cisgender just means on the side of your gender. So cisgender just means you're not trans. So
Yes.
if you don't have any sort of incongruence between your sex and your gender, then you're cisgender. I'm As a general rule, I try to use terms that people use of themselves. Okay. Now, and I don't want to fast forward to the pronoun debate, or even like transgender. The reason why I don't use transgenderism is because most trans people don't like that. So, but I want to be consistent with using terms that people did not choose for themselves. So I never use the term cisgender. I typically avoid the word gender as much as I can, unless I really mean gender, because gender can be used 11 different ways by 10 different people. Most people use it with wild inconsistency, with all kinds of assumptions that I think are unhelpful. So I don't even like the term gender unless I really do mean my internal sense of who I identify as. So I'm not completely opposed to it, and sometimes you'll see me use it. But I typically try to avoid it. It's not something that I've chosen for myself. And oftentimes, kind of like transgenderism, cisgender is oftentimes used in a negative context. Usually it's coupled with white, male, straight, cisgender, blah, 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 and it's like, well, yeah. So I try to avoid it.
All right. So again, those kinds of sensitivities are just helpful, as we all are making choices of what words to use. All right. So for a long time, we have lumped LGBT. Sorry, see, I just did it again. We have lumped LGB together with T. Okay,
Yeah.
as if sexual orientation and gender identity are essentially very similar.
Right.
but they're actually quite different. And so let's just pause for a moment. What are some of the key differences as you think about sexual orientation versus gender identity?
Yeah.
And then what implications does it have as we're considering them from a Christian perspective?
Yeah, great. I'm glad you brought that up because I've over the years, not I just like early on, but now more and more, I only use LGBT or LGBTQ plus if I actually mean to include all of these very diverse kinds of experiences, which I don't like it when LGBT is used as a synonym for gay, because a
Yeah,
lot of trans people are straight. A
right.
lot of, I mean, most LGBT people are, here I go, cisgender, or they don't experience gender dysphoria. So, yeah, huge difference between LGB and T. The primary difference on a base level is that LGB has to do with sexual orientation or sexual attraction, who you are sexually attracted to. Whereas T, again, is a very broad umbrella term that has to do with who you identify as, or typically speaks to some kind of incongruence between your biological sex and your internal sense of who you are, which most LGB people don't experience. There's also, this is something that some people aren't aware of, other people are very aware of, but even within LGBTQ conversations, especially when you get outside the church, there's a lot of tension. I mean, massive tensions between the L's and the T's. So if
Okay.
somebody says I am LGBT, it's like, well, which one are you? Because many L's would be not at all on board with the T's, and even some of the B's are misunderstood inside. It's
Yep.
there's so much complexity and tensions within that acronym that I want to be really specific on what are we talking about here. The one commonality, of course, is that most LGBTQ plus people have experienced maybe some tensions or animosity between them and the church. So if we're talking on a broad level like that, I think it's okay.
Thank you. All right, so back to that key question. And you do this early in your book. You say, look, the key question for us to
Mhm.
wrestle with is if someone experiences incongruence between their biological sex and their internal sense of self, which one determines who they are and why?
Yeah.
So just say a little bit more about why this is the key question before we.
Yeah, it's the key question because um well, I'll start with the discipleship aspect of it. I mean, discipleship is becoming more like Jesus, but also becoming living into the imago Dei, the image of God that we are created to be. It's living more in line with Genesis 1 and 2, not further away from it. It's living more in line with our future resurrected state. There is a teleology to our discipleship, an end goal, like something we're moving towards. Um, to understand who we should try to become more of, we need to understand who we are. Or as I say in the book, I use a fancy, ontology. The nature of being who we are is directly related to discipleship, who we are growing into. So yeah, if you have a biological male who identifies as female, which one are they and why? Like that, I think it's a massive question, because if there is this incongruence there, this tension, which one is the one we should be moving towards? Which one is a more accurate statement of who we are? Now, and I give I think a fairly clear answer to this question in the book. I mean, I give my response to that question. But I want people to know. I mean, it took me 5 years of research and 60,000 words, and loads of listening and talking and studying to really come to I think, a relatively firm answer to that question. It's more complicated than people sometimes may realize. Because I would say maybe the majority of listeners might say, well, obviously your biological sex determines who you are. And for the record, that's the position I hold. I think that's scientifically and theologically accurate. Um, but there's a lot of interesting things we have to work through. The relationship between the body and the brain. If you were to take my brain out of my body and put it into Michelle's head and took her
Yeah.
brain and mine, and which one am I? Like, am I now Michelle, or is Michelle? Like, that's an interesting question. And according to Elon Musk, I mean, that might not be too far fetched
Oh
in the
boy.
near future. So, um, yeah, the relationship between the brain and the body, which one determines personhood. Yeah, these are all like really, I think, important questions to wrestle through. But at the end of the day, having worked through all that, I do believe um, God determines who we are through our biological sex, in as much as that biological sex is clear. Because there are some cases, obviously, with intersex people where it might be ambiguous.
Hmm. Okay. Let's talk about gender dysphoria for a minute. When I first started learning about the trans experience or experiences, I was conflating the two. Gender dysphoria and trans are like the same thing.
Yeah.
I've since learned they are not. So can you comment a little bit on what is gender dysphoria and how does it relate to the term transgender or
Okay.
trans?
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah. We shouldn't conflate the two. Many trans people experience gender dysphoria. Not all do. Gender dysphoria is simply the more recent psychological description used to describe the distress that some people experience as a result of this incongruence between their biological sex and their internal sense of self. It used to be called gender identity disorder, but in the 2013 fifth edition of the DSM, they changed it to gender dysphoria. So some older articles, you'll still see GID, gender identity disorder cited, but that's an older term. Um, Gender identity, sorry, gender dysphoria, several things. It exists on a spectrum. It can be mild, moderate to severe. It is malleable, meaning it's not, it doesn't always stay there, and we don't know why. In fact, according to all the studies done on gender dysphoria in children, anywhere from 61 to 88% of children with gender dysphoria, it ends up going away after puberty, left alone. Like, this isn't like, conversion therapy or what. No one's trying to, it just goes away naturally. You have early onset gender dysphoria that can start from the ages of 2, 3, 4 years old, and sometimes it lasts a lifetime, sometimes it goes away. You have late onset gender dysphoria, which comes upon maybe somebody in their late teens or early 20s. You have a new kind of category called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which seems to have some kind of social influence, part, at least in part, and on it goes. It's just it's a very complicated, mysterious condition that some people experience, and we're still at the beginning stages of kind of understanding it. Yeah, I can keep going, but I'll stop there to make sure we get to other questions.
So a couple.
Sorry, Michelle. So
Yeah.
within the trans conversation, there is a growing movement, especially among younger trans people, that say, well, there's a debate within the trans community. One side says to be truly trans, like, what does it mean to be trans? Well, to be trans, some people will say, means you have to have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. If you don't have actual gender dysphoria, you're not really trans. There's a whole nother side that says, they might say it like this, like, well, I don't need some medical gatekeeper to tell me I'm trans. If I'm trans, I'm trans. I don't need a medical sheet of paper to tell me that. So there's actually a lot of tension within the gender dysphoria trans conversation that, what does it mean to be really trans? So not every trans person has gender dysphoria. In fact, if you assume that, that could be offensive to some people, like you're projecting some
Right.
medical hurdle that people need to jump through to be trans. So if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person.
Okay, all right. So just a couple points of clarification. So gender dysphoria currently is included in the DSM.
Yes. So, I think I know what you're getting at. The DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders,
Yeah.
Which by definition means that gender dysphoria is considered by very progressive medical professionals as a mental disorder, and yet that has a stigma behind it. And so there's a lot of tension within the medical community about keeping it in the DSM. To get insurance purposes for surgeries, you need to have something that needs to be, quote, fixed. But then to say somebody needs to be fixed can be offensive too. So it's kind of a catch-22, which some people say is why they changed it from gender identity disorder, which sounds very like something's wrong with you,
Okay.
to gender dysphoria, which is I experience distress. And some people might say it's because society hasn't accepted me yet. So it's their problem, not mine. But there's nothing wrong with me. There's something wrong with everybody else that can't accept me for who I am. What might be the way they would frame it. So yeah, lots of politics that are in this conversation, which makes it interesting and complicated.
Okay. Well, it is helpful, I think, for us as pastors to make a distinction between someone who is experiencing extreme distress through gender dysphoria and someone who is just, hey, I feel like being the opposite sex today, I mean, or
Yeah,
like most of my peers are experimenting with fluidity. I'd like to try it. Like
yeah,
those are very, very different kinds of things, kind of on opposite poles. And I think we need to have different approaches.
yeah, yeah. Well, and to add to that, the whole concept of gender, and this is another discussion, and there's a range of perspectives on this, but the whole concept of gender, when used in distinction to sex, does seem to be wrapped up in some older 20th century cultural stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And this is why some of the group of people that are most concerned with some aspects of a trans ideology, not every trans person, but some maybe more activist types on the trans side. The people that are most concerned about that are highly liberal, radical feminists who have spent 100 years trying to push back against these very male centered views of what it means to be a true woman. But uh, in some conversations within the greater T, conversation, it does seem that these gender stereotypes are becoming a foundation to determine who really is a man, woman, or is trans, and so on. And we can get into more of that if we need to. But I have a chapter in my book just on gender stereotypes because I do think it's an important
Oh,
factor.
that's absolutely right. I mean, you talk about how, for example, the color pink used to be a solidly male color
Yeah,
culturally, in America. When was that? Like 100 years ago or something? I don't remember
100 years
what.
ago, yeah.
Yeah. So it was, pink was male. Anyway, so we have to be careful too to it's hard not to impose stereotypes on people
Right.
in terms of style and basic preferences and things like
Yeah.
that. All right. Um, Social contagion. Let me just ask you about that. You talk about social contagion. What is that? What does it have to do with this conversation?
Yeah.
And maybe also comment on the rise. You said there's like a
Yeah.
5,000% rise of trans identifying with people in, was it England?
And the UK, but it's true of every Western wealthy country, which is also an interesting question. You could that rise is happening in Australia, Europe, US, Canada. Any Western, mostly white wealthy country is experiencing that.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, and let me just give because if some people listening are familiar with this discussion, at various points in my talk, you might say, "Well, that's controversial." It's like, let me just say this really clearly. Everything in this conversation is controversial. So
Okay.
the very idea of social contagion is controversial. The very conversation about this rapid increase in teens identifying, that's controversial. Everything's controversial. So we just kind of need to get over ourselves and use language as humanizing as we can and do a lot of research and don't let kind of political correctness drive which aspects of the conversation we're willing to look into. So yes, there in the last few years, there was a term coined called rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD, coined by a liberal researcher named Lisa Littman from Brown University. Okay, so not a not a Bob Jones-ish kind of school, Um, and she did a study on over 250 parents whose kids came out as trans kind of overnight, like seemed to come out of nowhere with no prior history of gender dysphoria. And they all had very similar social environments, heavy online use where they were watching out like 6 to 8 hours a day on kind of very trans affirming kind of YouTube and Reddit conversations. They're in a social environment where being trans elevates their social status. It doesn't bring it down. They're in a friendship group where oftentimes they come out in clusters. You know, they come out as trans, and the parent looks at their school, and like 4 or 5, 6 of their friends came out as trans that week. Their best teacher, favorite teacher came out as trans. And so, and a high percentage of them are wrestling with other co-occurring mental health issues. They're 10 times more likely to be on the autism spectrum. A high percentage are biological females, which historically gender dysphoria affects males at a much higher rate. I think it's 4 to 1 maybe, but that there's been an inversion in the sex ratio and a hockey stick increase among biological females. So that's race. So all of those ingredients are there, which raises the question: is there some kind of, they say, social contagion, something in the culture, online culture, school culture, that might be playing some kind of role in nudging a trans identity, or causing, in particular, biological females to explore a trans identity? Now, again, that's controversial. You can't say that. Well, I just don't think it's very helpful to just ignore, a possible situation, and understanding of which will help you love people better, just because some people say you can't say that, So, yeah, we know that human identity is shaped by culture, not determined solely, but I mean, of course, teenagers are influenced, especially by their social environment. And you throw in things like gender stereotypes into the mix, and it's just throws another curveball in. There's a quote from a teenage girl in a book I was reading that she said, there's no such thing as tomboys anymore. Like, either you're a feminine girl or you're trans. Like, you can't really be a non-feminine girl. You need another identity to kind of fit into.
Oh, wow.
Whereas 20 years ago, Michelle, I think I'm a little older than you. You had a whole range of, girls who played sports, who were feminine, who were in between, who short hair, long hair. And that was kind of, there's a breadth to the female experience. But now in some circles, not everyone, but in especially more progressive environments, trans identities, again, the umbrella term, are readily available, and even made or kids are encouraged to explore that. So yeah, I have a chapter just on this specific conversation, trans teenagers, but this is a point of serious debate and contention within the trans community. A lot of older trans people are very concerned about the high number of teenagers transitioning and pursuing medical intervention. So yeah, this isn't a this isn't a liberal versus conservative thing. There are in the trans conversation, you cannot hide behind your progressive or conservative tribe, because there's loads of very, very, very liberal people who are raising concerns about certain aspects of this conversation. So we actually have to tackle the issues and think through them.
Okay, thank you. From this point forward, I'm going to start sprinkling in questions that we're receiving, okay, just to make sure we can get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so hopefully a quick one here. Can you explain the statement that most trans people are straight?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't say most. If I did say it, then let me correct it. I'm not saying most trans people are straight. Some trans people are straight, meaning they are attracted to the sex that is opposite of their biological sex. This is much more common among biological males who identify as trans. There's anywhere from, I've seen percentages anywhere from 50 to 75% of biological males who identify as trans who might also be attracted to females. And sometimes, there's another term, autogynephilia, that is related to that I won't get into because I want to stay to the point. Yeah.
Oh,
so
yeah,
it's more common among biological males than biological females who identify as trans.
Great. And I think it's just really important to remind ourselves that when we're talking about trans, we're talking about gender identity. We're not saying anything about who they're attracted to sexually. Right. It's like a completely separate subject. Yeah. And so anyway, all right, let's see. Let me ask you this one here. How do you understand male and female in the first creation story as a part of binary only descriptions? That is day and night. What about dawn and dusk? Mm-hmm. Land, sea. What about estuaries, beaches, and swamps? And what about the platypus?
Yeah. Yeah, and asteroids and marshes and yeah. So yeah, um this is a common point that's been brought up for a while now. So just to kind of expand on the question, in Genesis 1, you don't have an exhaustive explanation of creation. Again, you have land and sea, but what do you do with swamps? They're kind of like, are they land? Are they sea? Are they in between? So Genesis 1 is not trying to give an exhaustive account of creation. So some people would say because it's not being exhaustive, it's just giving maybe polar ends of a spectrum. Therefore, at the end of Genesis 1, when it's male and female, those also are polar ends of a spectrum with all kinds of in betweens that could exist between male and female. Yeah, my response to that is male and female are describing biological sex in Genesis 1. That to me is not disputed. And I'm happy to acknowledge, like, here's where I lean on this interpretation. There's other things that are just there. Male and female, Genesis 1:27 is describing biological sex. The very next verse talks about be fruitful and multiply, connected to our reproductive capabilities. Male and female is also used to describe animals going into the ark and animals elsewhere. That's not referring to their gender identity. Animals don't have a gender identity. And so male and female. And so we know from science that Homo sapiens are a sexually dimorphic species. Um, we reproduce when a sperm is fused with an egg, and the terms we use to describe those sex categories are male and female. The Bible agrees with that. This is one place where science and the Bible are not at odds. So all that to say, when it comes to sex categories used to describe humanity, Homo sapiens, there are two, male and female. Even somebody who has maybe a severe intersex condition might be a blend of both, but male and female are still the two sex categories, and they might be both male and female, but they're not like a third sex or something other. So now, so when it comes to Genesis 1, even though there's rivers and marshes and in between this, when it comes to biological sex, male and female are the only two sex categories that the Bible or science recognizes. Now, is there diversity in how people are male and female? Of course. We're tall, we're short, we're type A, type B, Enneagram 8, wing 1, or whatever. 8, wing 9. So yeah, there's loads of diversity in how people are male and female, but there is not other sex categories in addition to male or female. That's both a biblical observation and scientific one. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, let me ask you, I'm going to try to condense this one here,
Okay.
but it's, I think, an important one for us to engage. Okay, so this is coming from a pediatrician.
Okay.
There's a huge risk to our church training pastors, youth workers, and parents that children diagnosed with gender identity disorder should stay in their assigned birth gender. For decades, parents and kids were given this advice, and it leads to depression and suicide. There's been a strong consensus in the medical community for many years now that this is the wrong approach. And then this pediatrician also mentions the AAP, or the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement on caring for transgender youth, which anybody can find online. So go ahead and engage with that. I do think you cover a little bit of that in your book, but please, whatever you'd like to say in response.
Sure. Yeah. I appreciate the question. And just to be super clear, I'm not a pediatrician. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a medical professional. I did have to read loads of stuff for this book, but as I say in the book, I mean, all I'm doing is summarizing a bunch of research that I've read, and I had to talk to a lot of psychologists and endocrinologists and really kind of rely on the experts to help me understand this side. So huge caveat, I'm not a medical professional. People out there, fact check everything I say, okay?
Yeah, and let me also give a caveat, which is that the ECC does not advocate specific medical treatments
Right.
at this time. Yeah. So
let me respond with the limited knowledge I have. First of all, the gender identity disorder, that's an older term that is now, after 2013, is out of date. So nobody should be, if somebody's diagnosed with gender identity disorder, you're seeing a doctor who hasn't been reading the research in the last 8 years or 9 years, the DSM, which is like the main stand, so that nobody would be diagnosed with gender identity disorder today. um I'm also, the phrase assigned gender, see, this is where I'm going to push on the definition. Are people assigned an internal sense of self? Or when a baby's born, does the doctor say, "Congratulations, it's a masculine"? No, no, I don't know if
Yeah.
my baby's. It's either a male or female, which isn't that's recognized, not assigned. So if we go with the current consensus on what gender even means, that's not assigned. I mean, sex isn't even assigned; it's recognized. But even gender, that's not, unless you use like a pre-1970s understanding of gender, which is a synonym with biological sex. So when it comes, but the main bulk of the question deals with kind of a medical consensus regarding um, how to care for trans identified teens. That doesn't exist. So that's where I would, again, I'm not a medical professional, but I mean, I've got a 42 page document compiling loads and loads and loads. I mean, I got a here on my desktop of just like medical professionals that don't agree with that. The Society for Evidence-Based Medicine out of Oxford University, several endocrinologists that are, I mean, that are
Okay, and
leaders in the
actually, let me
field.
just interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
Why are they not agreeing with that? I think that that's really helpful because we're
Yeah.
not talking about like they're disagreeing because of what the Bible says. You're talking about
No, none of these are
secular
Christians.
forces.
No, they're all like pro-gay marriage or very liberal, not religious at all.
So what are they
Let me frame the question too, just in case it wasn't clear for the rest of the audience. How do we care for trans-identified teens in particular?
Yes.
Do we use medical intervention, which would begin with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then in their mid to late teens, maybe surgical interventions? Do we try to align their biological sex with their gender identity, or do we try to align their gender identity with their biological sex? Again, it's that question of incongruence. Which one are they? If they're experiencing distress, what needs to be addressed here? That's the big debate. Now, within the medical community, you have three different primary approaches. You have the gender affirming only approach, which says their internal sense of self is who they are and everything else needs to conform to that. That's taken by, the United States and some Western countries, but the UK is rethinking that, Europe's rethinking that, the General College of Medical Practitioners in the UK are all coming out saying, we kind of got this wrong. We need to rethink our model again. The classic model is either watchful waiting or the biopsychosocial model, which says if somebody's experiencing gender dysphoria, let's explore all kinds of other psychological possibilities: past trauma, internalized misogyny, or internalized homophobia, and other, a misunderstanding of what it means to be male or female, or some social environments. Let's explore many other possibilities before we pursue irreversible medical intervention. I would say that perspective um, would be globally more widely accepted, and certainly historically. The gender affirmative only approach that seems like, I'm assuming that the question
Yeah.
was kind of saying that's kind of the consensus. That's just, I mean, as graciously and cautiously as I can, I would say that's just simply inaccurate. There is no medical consensus that the gender affirmative only approach is agreed upon by medical professionals. So, yeah.
I think
Is
part
that
of what is
okay? Is that, I know we're getting
yeah,
lost in the
no,
weeds here, and yeah.
I think part of what is helpful to remember as well, and again, just from a secular standpoint, a couple of things. As you mentioned, some of these interventions are irreversible or very hard to reverse or have like long-term effects, right?
Mhm.
So even from a secular vantage point, many are saying, watchful waiting, or just let's wait before we respond with these
Yeah.
strong interventions, right?
Especially when the majority of kids with gender dysphoria will desist, that it will go away. So it just
That's the
doesn't.
other key piece. Let me highlight it. So you said, say it one more time. Most
Yeah, well, more
teenagers,
specifically,
yeah,
61 to 88%, according to every single study done on children with gender dysphoria, 61 to 88% that gender dysphoria goes away without any kind of intervention once they go through puberty. So and this is why, yeah, well, I could keep going on, but I mean, again, there's some very, very liberal, particularly lesbians and feminists that are deeply concerned about, for instance, Joanna Olson Kennedy is a primary advocate of the gender affirmative only model, and she's received $5.7 million from the government to perform double mastectomies on girls as young as 13 years old. This is in peer-reviewed medical journals. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. And I'm just
Yep.
call me backwards, but I'm just cautious about cutting the breasts off of a 13-year-old because she wants to be a boy at 13. I think we need to be raising some questions about that.
Okay, I have a few questions here which are kind of similar vein. Let me read one. I see the church making the right overtures to those who are caught in a sinful lifestyle, but I don't see the church holding the line on the sinful rebellion that it is.
That what
Okay.
is? Or
Okay, that was a word for word. Let me read it one more time. I see the church making the right overtures to those who are caught in a sinful lifestyle, but I don't see the church holding the line on the sinful rebellion that it is. And then this, let me also read this next piece, okay? It might be from the same person, but I'm not sure. My question is, how should the church respond when someone resists or outright declines to repent of sexual sin? I take my cues from Jesus's interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. Our Lord intentionally interacted with this dear soul, even at the risk of social scorn. He met her where she was at. He didn't demand anything from her at first. He didn't stiff arm her, professing he was too holy for her. He didn't shame her, etc. But he did not let her off the morality hook either. He confronted her with her sinful lifestyle and then let her choose how to respond. Mm-hmm. So, and it was just clarified, these are from the same person.
Yeah, no,
yeah.
okay. I appreciate the question. It's a really good one. There's obviously a pastoral urgency with the question, especially in 2021 with sexual, I'll just say sexual morals across the board are just all over the map. I guess I want to point out that this whole conversation isn't on sexual orientation or sexual behavior. We're talking about the trans conversation. So in a sense, that the question itself would be for another webinar, which I'm sure you've addressed. I'm happy to address it. But I do want to point, because I do think some of the, and I'm not saying the questioner is doing this, but some people will say, LGBT people, they just need to repent. Like, whoa. Those are broad, like, okay, take somebody who experiences unwanted gender dysphoria, a psychological condition that they didn't choose. What are they repenting from? Well, they need to stop doing it. Doing what? Like, what is the it? Like, just stop experiencing an unwanted psychological condition. Like, that obviously that doesn't make sense. Now, if we're talking specifically about somebody engaging in sex outside of a male-female marriage, whatever their identity is, yes, we all need to repent from that. But again, with the trans conversation, we're not necessarily like the sexual piece, the sexual activity piece or whatever that's involved maybe, but that's not what the primary question is around the trans identity and experience.
So, okay, when we think about this kind of the sinful rebellion and what is its application or relevance to the trans conversation. I mean, I wonder if people are thinking about, let's say, celebrity culture, right? Celebrity culture where it just seems like, hey, I wake up today, this is who I want to be today. Tomorrow I'll be somebody else. The next day I'll be somebody else. You know what I mean? And I, without that associated gender dysphoria, but just kind of, I don't know.
So there are moral questions. They're more complicated, but there are moral questions, I think, surrounding human identity. Is it a moral issue to embrace your biological sex? What does it mean to embrace your biological sex? And well, they shouldn't cross dress, whatever. It's like, okay, so if what does that mean in a Western culture where women can wear blue jeans or a dress, and a man can wear a silky shirt or whatever, wear pink? Like you find, if you start asking some deep questions about what we're actually asking, you start realizing there's some complex layers here. So
Like,
I will
it's
say this,
okay
I
to
do
change
think,
your fashion style. It's okay
right,
to
right,
change your
right.
fashion sense, but
To keep
go
it
ahead.
as general as possible, I do think that a disciple of Jesus should, as part of their discipleship journey, embrace their biological sex as a significant part of human identity. Now, the thinkers listening are going to say, "What does that mean?" And that's a good question. That's I'm keeping it deliberately up here because then we can kind of get down into the weeds and maybe say, "Okay, what does that mean practically?" But as a general thing, I do think God determines who we are, whether we're male or female, based on our biological sex. But how we live that out, the Bible gives us loads of freedom. I mean, you have men who chop off the heads of giants like King David. Then David turns around and he starts writing poetry, playing his harp and weeping over his best friend Jonathan. He says, your love to me was better than the love of women. It's like, that doesn't sound very masculine to me, but the Bible says, no, living out your male identity is, I'm giving you a lot of freedom. You don't have to be stuffed into some box of masculinity. You just have to be godly, follow me, be kind, be sober minded, be generous, turn the other cheek when people hit you, be godly. Oh, if you're masculine, great. If you're not very masculine, great. You're still male. Follow me and be godly in the diversity of the human experience.
Good. All right, we only have time for just a few more here. I do want to say we received a question from a mom with a young adult child who is now transgender. I'm going to follow up with you, okay, after this. So I won't ask that right now.
Okay.
Okay. Any thoughts on the J.K. Rowling and others who fall under the label TERF or trans exclusionary radical feminist?
Yeah. Everybody knows who J.K. Rowling is. Some people might not know that she has spoken out in favor of a more feminist position, which again has clashed with some trans ideologies. TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist. I don't. That's a term I don't use either because it is considered to be a slur,
Okay.
derogatory term against the people, like thrown at people who are being attacked. The more proper term is gender critical feminist. These are people who believe that biology determines whether you're a woman or not. And they're people that are feminists who are deeply concerned with, I'm repeating what they would say, okay? Feminists who are deeply concerned with biological males, yet again, asserting privilege in women's spaces, women meaning biological females, and kind of even taking over the kind of LGBT movement. And this is why there's a whole movement of lesbians in particular. There's a movement in the UK called Get the L Out. Like, lesbians, let's go do our own thing, because once again, we're being dominated by males again. Again, this is the gender critical feminists, what are sometimes slurred as TERFs. Now, J.K. Rowling, I don't think she would be a strong gender critical. Well, I think she would be a gender critical feminist without being she's not like an academic in that sense, but she would say, yeah, I think biology determines whether you're a woman or not. And that's, and she spoke out simply defending people who had that position. She wasn't really going full on attack for that position. She's saying we can't marginalize people who say, hey, I think biology determines whether you're a woman or not. Like that, I'm going to stand up for people to be able to voice that. Kind of seems to be a pretty reasonable, position. So yeah, I read her lengthy blog twice. I thought it was, I don't agree with everything, but I thought it was good and helpful. Wasn't bigoted. I don't think she's transphobic at all. And a lot of older trans people would very much agree with her. So.
All right. So this is going to be the final question, but I do want to say this, friends. If you had a question that we did not get to cover today, please email us, embrace@covchurch.org, and we'll do our best to get you a response. Okay. Can't promise you, but we really do want to do our best to minister well. Final question. Can you comment on the Equality Act being debated in Congress?
I don't know if I can. I mean,
I don't
yeah, I
even
don't want
really
to
know what
watch.
it says, honestly.
Yeah, I don't want to get over my skis and comment on it. From the little I've tried to understand, I think there's some helpful aspects and some potentially unhelpful aspects to it. I the big one is athletics, and yeah, I do think that athletics should be segregated, or there should be spaces where biological females don't need to compete against biological males. And that's where a lot of the concern with the Equality Act, because according to the language, it could be interpreted as if you prevent a biological male who identifies as female from playing in female sports, that's discriminating against somebody who identifies as trans. And so I think that that perspective is really problematic. But there's a lot of other things. I mean, I think it's insane that a trans person would be excluded from getting an apartment, complex,
Right.
or getting a job, or like, of course we don't want to discriminate against people based on their gender identity. But when it comes to male and femaleness of humanity, there are some social complexities here that we need to be more aware of. So that's the
Very
extent
good.
of what I got.
Preston, thank you so much. I will close with this. Just want to make sure everybody knows that we are having one more conversation with Preston in April. That one will be moderated by Tim Ciccone, and he's going to be talking about and exploring a new youth curriculum, a comprehensive curriculum on Christian sexuality, which the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender has put together. And we're really excited about that as a resource for our youth. So we want to encourage you to come out, learn more about that curriculum. Wednesday, April 28th. And again, if you didn't get your question in today or get it answered, embrace@covchurch.org and we'll do what we can. Friends, blessings on the journey. See you next time.
Thanks.